Okay, hello and welcome to the Weed Seed Shift in Soybeans, Managing Resistant Weeds. My name is Claire Weinzierl and I'm the Communications Manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. Please join me in thanking our corporate partner, FMC, for sponsoring our webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will answer those following the presentation. And one more note that today's webinar will be recorded in the event you would like to rewatch or share with your network. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Nick Hustedde and Brent Neuberger. Nick Hustedde earned his bachelor's degree in plant and soil science and master's degree in plant, soil, and agricultural systems, specializing in weed science from Southern Illinois University. Nick serves as a technical service manager for FMC Corporation, focusing on research and development, as well as providing technical information to his sales team in the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. His goal is to contribute insight on current and new product concept strategies through research and development. Brent Neuberger earned his master's degree from Iowa State University in crop production and physiology. Brent serves as a senior technical sales manager at FMC Corporation and has been with the company for 27 years. He focuses his time on providing the most relevant and accurate technical information to his sales team in the states of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Brent grew up on a farm in central Iowa and is still involved and just as passionate in farming today. Today, they will be presenting the Weed Seed Shift in Soybeans, Managing Resistant Weeds. During today's presentation, you will learn new ways to enhance your weed management program throughout this discussion of fundamentals of the weed seed bank, as well as important factors to consider when choosing soybean trait strategies and making holistic management plans. Please join me in welcoming Nick and Brent.
All right, well, appreciate the introduction, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate you attending today. So in this webinar, we're going to focus on some of the fundamentals of weed seed bank, reduction and discuss some of the driver weed species that encompass prolific seed production, as well as the evolution of resistance at the field level and in terms of what drives it. And Brent will kind of close out by defining a long-term effective weed management program, implementing a start clean, stay clean strategy with an emphasis on zero tolerance for weed escapes. So let's begin by discussing some of the fundamental aspects of weed resistance, as it is one of the major challenges in the industry and a threat to contemporary weed management for growers in the Midwest. So this is just a snapshot of the number of unique herbicide-resistant cases in the Midwest, and the map illustrates that the distribution of resistant biotypes really isn't a state-specific issue. As we look across the region, you can see that Illinois and Kansas are kind of leading the pack, but as we look across some of the other key row crop-producing states within the region, there's several different species that have been reported resistant, and certainly this can challenge our herbicide programs regardless of the cropping system. So I wanted to take some time to discuss the biology around pigweed species and waterhemp in particular. So waterhemp, as well as palmer amaranth, actually are dioecious species. And so that means that you have male and female plants, and outcrossing must occur in order to make progeny. And that forces a great deal of genetic diversity. And if we think about this hypothetically, a female waterhemp plant could make over 400,000 flowers, and by applying the same logic, this female could receive pollen from 400,000 different male donors, and it drives a lot of diversity. And that's apparent when we evaluate the phenotypes in the field. You can have plants with green stems, red stems, or both, and varying plant architecture. So genetic diversity is also expressed through herbicide resistance. And just for reference, waterhemp biotypes in Illinois have now evolved resistance to 7 different sites of action. So this certainly complicates weed management programs, as in the past, when we had resistance to a specific herbicide, we just added a material from a different mode of action. And with multiple resistance, there's fewer tank mix options to choose from, and it demonstrates the importance of selecting herbicides with effective sites of action to build that overall program. So as we look at the left-hand side of the screen, this is some work that was done by Dr. Trainell and one of his graduate students, I believe, back in 2010. But the gist of it is that, about 10 to 11 days after pollination, we have viable seed on that waterhemp plant. So it tells us that we really need to remove those plants, prior to that period. And if we think about 2019 and the prevent plant acres that we were up against, I think it kind of recharged the soil seed bank, so to speak. And in many cases, we had growers that might have went out and desiccated these prevent plant acres with a herbicide, or maybe even mowed them, but we were well after that pollination period, and we really weren't able to do anything to reduce the amount of viable seed going back into the soil seed bank. Also, as I'm driving across the countryside, many times I'll notice Waterhemp plants that have been desiccated late in the season, within a soybean crop, maybe by Liberty, and we feel good about that application because, we're revenge spraying, but in many cases, we already had viable seed on that plant, which is going to be returned back to the soil. So as we look at the bar chart data on the right-hand side of the screen, really it illustrates seed viability for Waterhemp. And this is some work that was done by Iowa State back in 2001. But on the vertical axis, we have percent of the original seed bank that's still viable. And on the horizontal axis, you can see we have the percent that's viable out to 4 years after seed drop. And what this tells us is that once we get to year 4, we only have about 10% of the original seed bank that's still viable. So if we can do a good job of practicing zero tolerance for 3 consecutive years, Mother Nature is going to start playing into our favor. And one thing I typically mention is, thank God Waterhemp and Palmer don't have the same seed viability characteristics as Morning Glory or Velvet Leaf, because if we had to deal with viable seed for 50 years, we'd never be able to get ahead of them. All right, so wanted to talk about multiple resistance. And as we think about the evolution of chemical herbicide tactics, we know that herbicide resistance isn't new. So it can be traced back to 1957 with a wild carrot population that was confirmed resistant to 2,4-D. But a more recent trend that's occurring is multiple resistance within specific biotypes. So if we use Waterhemp as an example, and many of our growers are obviously challenged by this weed, and we think about the wide adoption of ALS inhibiting herbicides in the 80s and 90s, this selected for resistance to the group 2 ALS inhibiting herbicides. So then in 1996, our growers had a shiny new tool with the adoption of the Roundup Ready technology, and in the same fields where they were using those group 2 herbicides and developed resistance, they started spraying glyphosate, which is a group 9. And so the overuse of glyphosate resulted in group 9 and group 2 resistance. And now we have stacked resistance. And of course, that's going to make any of our weed management programs more challenging. So at that point, many growers started revitalizing our diphenyl ether compounds or post-applied PPO inhibitors to manage these populations. And over time, we saw more widespread resistance to that mode of action as well. And now we've got resistance to 3 different modes of action. So the chart illustrates the trend in terms of multiple resistance and extrapolates where we could be headed, but it really depicts the importance of implementing those integrated weed management programs in order to slow the spread of resistance. And that's something Brent's going to discuss specifically in the coming slides. So as we move ahead to the cause of herbicide resistance, many are of the understanding that herbicides directly cause a genetic alteration in weeds to become resistant. And in reality, those resistant biotypes exist naturally within the field population. So our herbicide use selects for these biotypes to become more dominant due to their inherent ability to withstand herbicide exposure. And over time, that population is going to shift. So I wanted to take just a minute here to discuss the different types of resistance, those being target site and non-target site resistance. With target site resistance, it's due to a mutation of a specific enzyme in a plant where the herbicide binds, and so the herbicide can no longer attach that enzyme, allowing that plant to survive. As we think about non-target site resistance, it's really a catch-all for everything but an enzyme change. So it could be plant architecture, cuticle thickness, compartmentalization of the herbicide, or maybe even metabolic resistance. So as we think about metabolic resistance, this is certainly more of a threat to current weed management strategies. For Waterhemp, the most common metabolic resistance might involve a similar detoxification pathway as tolerant crops. So a similar process that corn would use to metabolize off atrazine or HPPD inhibiting herbicides. And this can be pretty scary, but keep in mind that just because you have resistance to a specific herbicide in your field, it doesn't mean that every plant confers that same resistance profile, but it does stress the importance of tank mixing multiple sites of action with each trip that we're making across the field. So now let's consider reduced rate exposure and its effect on herbicide resistance. And I tend to think of the trend in terms of rate selection as it relates to Roundup Ready crops. In the early stages of adoption, it was pretty common for growers to find the bottom of the glyphosate rate range for effective control. And as control slipped, the easy button was to go ahead and increase that rate. So initially, it wasn't out of the ordinary to achieve control with a pine or Roundup, but just a few years ago, many of our growers were employing 44 ounces as their base use rate, which is almost a 3x difference. And so if we evaluate the adoption of Liberty Technologies, I think a similar trend is occurring. And so is this a sign of what's to come? I'm not sure, but it definitely should be monitored. And I know that our university folks are keeping ahead of it pretty well. So also when we consider weed height at application, this too can be a form of employing a sublethal rate. And so many of our post-herbicide labels specifically state maximum weed heights of 4 inches. And practically speaking, this can be very difficult to achieve in a field setting. So it seems like there's always something that's deterring us from making timely applications, mainly weather events such as rainfall, that's going to keep us out of the field and allow these weeds to exceed that 4-inch weed height. So in reality, applying these herbicides on larger than labeled weed heights is initiating the same concept. Our larger plants have more metabolic capacity, more growing points to cover, thicker cuticles, the list goes on. And each of these can influence herbicide mobility in the plant and result in a sublethal dose. Okay, so this slide depicts the emergence patterns for driver weed species in my area. And what we see here is that there's some sort of emergence event occurring from March until December as it relates to a specific weed. So with Maristel, especially in those no-till situations, we can basically expect emergence to happen as long as the ground isn't frozen. As we switch to Waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth, with Waterhemp, it's typically going to begin to emerge in mid to late April and continue through August with rainfall. With Palmer Amaranth, it likes the drier and warmer soils, and it's normally going to get started in early May and continue through August with any light penetration through the canopy and soil moisture. And keep in mind that this is specific to my geography. So, if you're more from the Mid-South, I wouldn't guess you'd be on this webinar, but certainly you can see some of those species emerge earlier in the season. So with giant ragweed, it's somewhat adapted to our management strategies and has evolved to emerge later in the season outside of our normal tillage timing, as well as when our soil residual herbicide doses have degraded. So really what this sums up is that to manage all these species, it does require a diverse system employing multiple different sites of action with residual activity to target the emergence characteristics. All right, so as we get back to pigweeds, they may be dispersed in several different ways to populate new areas, but the primary mechanism is seed grade from the female plant in that specific field. So there's also many other avenues of dispersal, including water with flooding in particular, animals and birds, specifically migratory species such as waterfowl. And water hemp seed actually carries a static charge that allows them to attach to tillage equipment, tractor, combine tires, and really the list goes on. As we think about combines, they're also very efficient seed spreaders. So I'm sure most of you have seen the lines of weeds that emerge in the chaff row the following spring that were kind of corralled by the combine. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about pollen-mediated gene flow. And as we refer to the definition, it's the transfer of genetic information from one plant to another compatible plant, but gene flow between and within species is also possible. So with pollen-mediated gene flow, it became more of a concern with the adoption of herbicide-resistant crops and the potential ability to trade pollen with closely related weed species. And so I think about like wheat and ryegrass, or maybe even grain sorghum and sugarcane. So as we get back to weed resistance, in most cases, it's a dominant trait. So the pollen can transfer the resistance. And there's actually a study that was conducted by Nebraska that documented outcrossing can occur between Waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth at low frequency, 165 foot from the pollen source. So basically what the take home is that seed and pollen can transfer resistant alleles. So as we think about managing pollen-mediated gene flow, the same principles apply. We want to start clean, stay clean, utilize multiple modes of action, rotate herbicides and crops, and really focus on reducing seed return back into the soil seed bank. Okay, so this slide does a pretty nice job of setting the stage for soil seed bank management. And when we think about this practically, resistance is a numbers game. So the more individuals that are exposed to any given management tactic, the more likely we're going to select for resistance. And reducing selection pressure should really be a key priority for any weed manager. But this slide helps us understand the math on seed production and how quickly it can get out of hand. And of course, this is a hypothetical situation, but if we use it as an example, one female Palmer amaranth escape, could produce 300,000 seeds. And if we just factor in like seed predation and decay, as well as just inherent viability characteristics, let's consider a 95% loss. And so if we apply this math on year 2, we're starting with 15,000 seeds. And if we gain 99% control with our herbicide program, it still leaves 150 plants in the field. So if we hedge on the conservative side and estimate that 33% of the escapes are female, we're left with 50 plants capable of bearing seed. And so a modest estimate of seed production for these females could be 150,000 seeds per plant. And you can see that going into year 3, the seed bank really is getting out of hand. So I think it illustrates the importance of that zero tolerance program for seed return. Now let's transition to discussing some of the key strategies around the fundamentals of managing the weed seed bank. And so as we mentioned, one of the weaknesses of our pigweed species is viability over time. And again, if we think about this practically and we employ management tactics that minimize seed return for 3 consecutive years, it will exploit this weakness. So basically what I wanted to discuss is a 3-year study that's going to help us visualize soil seed bank management practically. And so this experiment demonstrates the impact that layered residual herbicide treatments can have on the soil seed bank over time. So if we look at the objectives, and we're not going to cover all these in detail, but we wanted to determine the effect of employing multiple herbicide sites of action on weed control, the number of escapes mid-season, the soil seed bank, and this was accomplished by taking soil samples from each respective treatment for grow outs, their resistance profile, and finally soybean yield. So I want to briefly discuss the treatment list for this study, and basically we evaluated 4 different concepts. We had layered residual, which consisted of an authority brand, and it varied by location, followed by dicamba, glyphosate, and Anthemax. We had a low-cost residual, which consisted of metribuzin pre, followed by glyphosate plus dicamba, post plus residual, which was glyphosate, dicamba, and warrant, and then all posts, which encompass glyphosate and dicamba in a single trip. So the treatments were applied in the same plot area each of the 3 years with the objective of limiting spatial variability and defining the respective influence on the soil seed bank over time. And so all these treatments were applied with typical small plot research equipment. As we move into the materials and methods, we covered most of the field analysis already, but I wanted to give you an idea of where each trial was conducted. So we had one trial with Purdue University in the eastern part of the state on a glyphosate, PPO, and ALS resistant biotype. We also had a trial at the University of Tennessee at their Jackson site, which is in the heart of Palmer amaranth country. And this was on a biotype that was confirmed resistant to glyphosate and PPO inhibiting herbicides. And then lastly, we went to Iowa to sponsor a trial with the on-farm network. So as we jump into water hemp control and just kind of setting this slide up in terms of treatments, I'll direct you to the horizontal axis, which illustrates the 4 different herbicide concepts that were evaluated. And so I'll set this first slide up for the next several as they're going to be laid out very similar. But on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see we've got the layered residual treatment. As we move to the right, we're evaluating a low-cost residual option and then looking at a post plus residual program, and lastly, all post. And what we notice here is that the only treatment providing greater than 95% water hemp control at 28 days after the post application, when we pulled it over a 3-year period, is that layered residual strategy. So as we evaluate all the other concepts, they're providing 80% control or less. And since water hemp is a very prolific seed producer, anything less than 95% control is not going to be adequate. All right, so now we're looking at weed counts pulled over that same 3-year period. And what we notice here is an inverse relationship, which is what we would expect. but the vertical axis depicts the number of water hemp plants that were counted per square meter, and these counts were taken mid-season. So what we notice is the layered residual concept is providing the greatest reduction in the number of water hemp plants. And as you move to the right, you'll notice that all three of the other concepts are allowing a significant number of escapes, and that's certainly going to increase the viable seed in the soil for subsequent seasons. But also, when we think about it in terms of selection pressure, if we're not using a strong residual component pre-emergence, we are exposing more individuals to those post technologies, which could select for resistance much quicker. So one other thing I wanted to mention is the potential for weed shifts. And in certain areas, we are observing more velvet leaf escapes, and perhaps this could be due to the widespread adoption of auxin technologies as well as Liberty that can be inherently weaker on this species. But what we notice in the data is much stronger activity on velvet leaf with a broad spectrum program employing multiple sites of action. So this illustrates that weed managers should be employing those robust management programs, targeting the whole weed spectrum rather than focusing on one specific problem. And Brent's going to cover, some of our specific recommendations, but certainly we can achieve very effective control with a layered residual strategy, beginning with an authority brand and following up with Anthem Max in season. So just looking at a couple glamour shots from the Purdue site. These images were collected 2 summers ago, which would be the 3rd year of the study. And the upper left-hand picture is the layered residual treatment. And you can see bare soil in between the rows, which illustrates the level of weed control that was achieved. So all other concepts resulted in several escapes, which not only contribute to increasing viable seed in the soil, but also rob those vital resources from the crop that can influence yield potential. All right, so this is arguably some of the most powerful data that we were able to capture from this trial. And just setting the slide up, we're looking at water hemp growouts as depicted by the vertical axis. And before we initiated herbicide treatments at the site, Purdue researchers collected soil samples from each respective plot area. They homogenized them in a bucket and placed the samples into trays, which are pictured on the right-hand side of the screen for growouts in the greenhouse. So the red bar is our baseline growout, and this was collected prior to starting the study, but it does provide a benchmark to compare to. So they pulled soil samples after the herbicide treatment in the fall of 2018, the spring of 2019 to account for any seed rot as well as predation, in the fall of 2019 after the 2nd year of herbicide use. So the 2020 growout data still needs to be added to this data set. That's on my list to do, but certainly I think this information is pretty powerful. So if we look at the viable specimens that were recorded after each sample accession, we see the green bar, and that's the pooled number. So you can see that the only treatment that reduced the number of viable specimens in the soil over this 2-year period is that layered residual application. And so as you look at all the other treatment regimes, there was a profound increase in viable water hemp plants. And so I think this slide illustrates the importance of those layered residual applications for sustainable control of water hemp. So as we move on to a similar trial that was conducted with the University of Tennessee on Palmer, this study is set up very similar to the Purdue trial. However, authority MTZ was used pre-emergence in that layered residual application. But the results are very similar, and it's evident that the only treatment that's effectively reducing the number of viable specimens in the soil, again, is that layered application. So this slide, excuse me, also illustrates, the amount of selection pressure that we're putting on our post technologies by not employing those residual herbicides, and also the subsequent risk of selecting for herbicide resistance to the few tools that are left. So moving ahead to the trial that was conducted with Iowa On-Farm Network, and just setting the slide up, we've got the Canopio score on the vertical axis, which essentially measures weed vegetation covering the soil, and the treatments are listed across the horizontal axis. And what we notice is 40% or higher weed cover registering in each treatment other than that layered residual approach. And so if we reference the aerial image on the right-hand side of the screen, it's relatively easy to pick out where those treatments were plotted out based upon our weed cover. All right, so I'll close out by discussing crop yield, and this was pooled over 2 years. And so what we notice is that by managing weeds throughout the season with a broad spectrum approach, it allows us to preserve those vital resources for the crop and optimize our yield. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but you can see the impact that our layered residual applications have on the overall yield potential. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brent to discuss some of the diverse management strategies to control weeds long term.
Thanks, Nick, and I'm hopefully going to do a nuts and bolts. I think Nick did a great overview talking about resistance, and obviously everybody's probably heard a lot of universities as well as other agronomists talk about resistance and mechanicisms and everything else. But I think if you don't take anything else from this whole presentation, this slide, I think, is the most important thing. Is we need to start clean to stay clean. This has been true 15 years ago. It was probably maybe forgot a little bit when glyphosate came out first because of how effective glyphosate was. And so some people got probably lazy, and we did a kind of a switch, and we did a lot of, as I would say, post-emerge activity, a lot of post-sprayings, probably some weeds that were taller than need to be sprayed. We were still able to kill them. And so really it kind of maybe got people in a not best practice, best mode of action to control weed management. But I think as we go forward, we really need to emphasize the importance of starting clean and staying clean. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see really what we're talking about. And I think you look at the slide on the left with no pre-emerge herbicide, we're starting at a disadvantage. And, with the resistance that Nick talked about, with multiple modes of action not working as well as they, it's going to be tough to come back from this and get good, effective weed control versus what we see on the right, where we started with a good pre. We talk about resistance, and the number of individuals, particularly to those post-emerge treatments that are exposed where we can develop resistance. There's a lot greater chance in that left than in the right side of the slide here. And then I guess I really look at, if we're really doing the best weed management out there and we're looking at a holistic approach, which would you rather have from protecting your investment, the cost of the seed, your fertilizer, and everything else? I think the plot on the right is where we're going to maximize our return and where we're going to have the best yield. There's that one on the left. Obviously, the weeds are pulling a lot of sunlight, pulling a lot of nutrients, moisture away from our crop. And so really we need to look at, what is going to be the best treatment. And so from FMC, what we can show on the next slide, we have a number of options. Our Authority Edge is one of our newest Authority products, but we've tailored a number of premixes because we feel that bringing multiple modes of action is very, very important. We have a number of different Authority products into that pre-segment because nobody's the same, whether you're in Northern Illinois or Southern Illinois, whether it's no-till, conventional till, different weed spectrums. We want to be able to pick which one fits on each individual field the best. And by having a diversity like this, I think we do a better job of really allowing people to tailor and get that best start. And so if we look in the next slide, there's a lot of key points on why we feel pre-emerges are important. And I mentioned earlier about, what had occurred with the dicamba or the Roundup and how I think when it was first introduced, it worked so well that it kind of set us back. And now we really need to go back and look at a weed management program throughout the season and really look at, hey, let's do a good job up front. That'll protect some of our newer traits, the dicamba and enlist traits and liberty traits, so that we don't lose those like we did the glyphosate. And obviously we need to really look at, preserving those yields and reducing the weed seed competition, particularly as we look at that point number 3. I think that better job that you can do pre-emerge, the better it sets you up, better it protects that top line yield. And then as we look at point 6 and 7, Nick talked a lot about Waterhemp and Palmer, but I think we need to really look at, hey, the pre's are out there for more than just Waterhemp. We got other key driver weeds depending on your area and why we have the multiple authority products. But again, we want to do as good a job controlling as many different weed species as we can before our post treatments come out there. And so we have a two-pronged approach. We use as much diversity as we can to really have a program that can be sustainable and work year after year. So if we go to the next slide, a lot of people are aware of the disease triangle. I like to put together what I call a weed control triangle, and particularly as we look at our authority products, we always want to look at the right rate. And obviously when that glyphosate was first introduced, we had a lot of reduced rates. And, we want to really get away from the reduced rates. We want to go to full labeled rates to give us as good a control and as long a control as we can with that particular herbicide. We want to look at multiple modes of action, and probably I should add a descriptive word in here. We want to use multiple effective modes of action. So there's a lot of times people talk about multiple modes of action, but how many are effective on the weed species that you are really concerned about? So as we talk about Waterhemp, we want to make sure that we have, if that's the problem, we want to have multiple effective modes on that Waterhemp. There are a number of modes of action that probably don't have as good a control or don't have the activity on the Waterhemp. So if they're in that premix, yeah, they're a mode of action on that acre, but they're not an effective mode of action. And then we really need to look at how we can vary application timings. And a lot of people talk about overlapping residuals. It's all about providing that season-long residual activity. Nick talked about the duration of how long the Waterhemp and the Palmer wheat seeds are going to germinate. And so one application at the start of the spring is sometimes going to be difficult to provide that residual control way out into August, and then we also always have to deal with Mother Nature and the weather. And so the more varied we have in our weed control program, the better we're going to look at. So if we look at that right rate, I think the next slide really is very, very important in the fact that this is pulling some information from a 2014 soil dissipation study that was done down in Tennessee. And you look at the different group 14s in their soil half-life, and it's very important as we're dealing with a species, particularly the Amaranthus species, the Waterhemp and the Palmer, of having a very long half-life, particularly since that wheat species are going to germinate later into the season. And so the longer we have, the better we're going to have control. And I think these next couple slides are going to really show what that half-life. So if we look at that 70-day half-life, and I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible, the herbicide concentration that we need for effective control, and I'm just going to use, these are fictitious numbers, is 15. If we start at 40 ppm of the herbicide, half-life means that 70 days later we're going to have 20, and then we go out to 140, we're going to have 10. So you can see in this example, we got 105 days of residual control. If our half-life or whatever product you choose has a shorter half-life, you're going to lose control a lot earlier. But this is at our full labeled rate. If we go to the next slide, here's what happens when we reduce that rate. And so instead of using 40 ppm, we started at 30 here, the herbicide concentration. So again, half the product is dissipated in 70 days. So we're down to where we lose control or where, the rate needed for control, we cross the x-axis. And so, by reducing the rate, we reduce the length of control. And for some of these species, we really don't want to do that. And the next slide really shows a good graphic representation of that overlapping residual, because we want to have residual control as long as we can possibly have. So our first application is going to start losing, its half-life, and we're going to start dissipating. Then we bring in that overlapping residual, that early post-treatment, starts the residual over, and so then they're overlapping. It's going to extend that window of residual control later into the season and really reduce the number of weed seeds that are going to germinate. So let's proceed with the next slide. So as we look at two of my favorite Authority products is Authority Supreme and Authority Edge. These are combinations of a very good group 14, the sulfentrazone, and a very good group 15, the pyroxasulfone. And so we've really combined the best 14 and 15 together. They're at a little different ratio. The Authority Supreme is a 1-to-1 ratio. The Authority Edge is a 1 to 1.8. So we have a little bit higher load of sulfentrazone on that Authority Edge. Has a very good fit on those heavy soils, and really, like I said, has shown, that's our newest one, has shown some very favorable responses in grower as well as university trials. So again, we see these as two of our benchmark products to really provide very, very good control. So let's go to the next slide and let's look at some of the data. And so really looking at these two products that I'm talking about, the Authority Edge and the Authority Supreme. And so this is a trial that was done up in Wisconsin. And I like this, you can show bar charts and data and stuff. I always like to get some input. And again, this is all university data. But the comment that the researcher gave me was the level of water hemp control with Liberty herbicide was quite variable. In general, it seemed to be poorer in plots with weaker pre-emerge herbicide treatments. The water hemp in these treatments tended to be taller and denser than the better pre-emerge treatments. So as we've gone from Roundup being, the driver and providing the control to the resistance, causing more and more issues, we have more Liberty out there. We're going to have more Xtend and Enlist. It seems like the Liberty, the Xtend and Enlist aren't going to control as big a water hemp as what Roundup used to. So, the old days of controlling 8, 10, 12-inch water hemp, it's a lot more difficult. These Liberty products, as well as Xtend and Enlist, we like to target that 3, 4-inch water hemp. And so by doing a better job with the pre-emerge treatment, that post-treatment is going to work better. And ultimately, we're going to have a better water hemp management program. So let's go to the next slide and look at the data. And so the pre's were applied on June 3rd. Post-treatments were applied July 3rd. If we go over to the way to the right, the average height at the post-application timing on the untreated check was 5.5 inches. I've circled some treatments with Authority Assist and Authority First. The water hemp was reduced from 5.5 down to 3. You can see the bottom bar charts with some competitive treatments, a lot of them in that 2 to 4 inch weed size. As you go and you look into the center of that chart, you can see the Authority Supreme, the Authority Edge treatments, overlapping residuals. In a lot of cases, the water hemp and the average weed height in those plots was anywhere from 3/4 to a couple inches. So a lot smaller. That Liberty worked better because that pre worked better. And so again, that's the emphasis that I have, is that weed control program is a combination of everything, and the better job you start up front, the better job you're going to be able to end and really provide the best level of control. If we just look at water hemp in the next slide, you can see that, as Nick had mentioned earlier, we'd like to see 90-95% control. In that red box chart of the competitive treatment, looking at water hemp at 22 to 30 to 45 days, there's only a few treatments that gave us above 90-95% control in that 22-day. Very few gave water hemp control at 30 or 40 above that 90. A lot of them didn't even, break the 80 level of control. If you look in the side, the black box, the Authority Edge treatments at 8 and 11 ounces, you can see that we're above 90% control all the way out to 45 days. And so again, it shows having the best group 14 and the best group 15 in that premix at the right rates, giving us the best level of control. And if we look at the next slide, we had some very good pressure in this plot. So you can see on the left what was the Authority Edge, on the right was the untreated. So some very heavy water hemp pressure, excellent level of control. And so, like I said, I always like to look at university data and do some comparison. Let's go to look at the next slide. This is some data that Iowa State compiled. And this is a combination of 5 years of data where they went and looked at individual modes of action, individual products within the groups. And so inside that red box is a number of group 15 herbicides. The acetochlor, the dimethyl-S-metolachlor, and the pyroxasulfone. That pyroxasulfone is a component in the Authority Edge and the Authority Supreme, and you can see that it has less variability and a higher level of control for water hemp than all the other group 15s. And so if you look at combining that pyroxasulfone with the sulfentrazone, the red star over on the right, which is some of the common premix partners and or that group 14 compared to flumioxin, both of them are very consistent. And so the variability of how they perform from year to year, wet years, dry years, was better, and their level of control was better. And so by putting the two of those together in some premixes, like the Authority Edge and the Authority Supreme, is doing a very, very good job. And the next slide really is some internal trials that we did, and really does a good job with a picture dictation. Excuse me there. So again, you look at a number of different species, down on the left axis there, you can see sorghum, kochia, green foxtail, large crabgrass, lamb's quarter, tall ivy leaf morning glory, pigweed species, and velvet leaf. And then you had the individual components on the left are some of the group 15s. On the right are some of the group 14s. And again, two of the best ones were the pyroxasulfone and the sulfentrazone. And so if we put the two of them together, we really marry up and overlap and do a very good job on a number of weed species. Obviously, we're targeting that water hemp and doing a very, very good job with that. But you got to look at multiple weed species. And again, the better job that pre can do, the better that post-treatment will work, because there'll be less pressure, and then we have less selection and selection pressure for resistance. Go ahead and go to the next slide. FMC is not involved in seed. We don't have a seed brand. We're solely concentrating on delivering the best herbicides, whether it's products that are already out in the marketplace or looking for new modes of action, trying to deliver new modes of action. So as we look at our present Authority brand of lineups that you saw earlier, we have a number of different Authority products, and it's really geared towards being able to pick the best one for your acre. Doesn't matter whether you're in a Liberty Link program, an Enlist program, dicamba program, conventional program. We want to start clean to stay clean, and we feel the Authority products really fit that bill in starting clean, so that then whatever program you're going to do, you're going to be able to be successful and have a very clean field at the end of the season. Next slide. So again, best management practices. Start clean to stay clean. I mean, we're talking, we got to get out there, whether it's no-till, conventional till, put that pre out there, multiple modes of action. We got to look at overlapping residual treatments. There's a combination of things, and I guess I look at it, there's no one size fits all program. You got to look at managing for your area. We got to make sure that we remain clean. Nick talked about that seed bank management, not letting escapes go, because if there's escapes, there's a high likelihood if there are escapes, there's a good chance that there probably escapes because of resistance. And then if we let that seed go out there, and especially ones like Waterhemp and Palmer, they're very dynamic, have a large number of weed seeds. That combine's a great spreader. And so obviously we're going to have some issues if we let those go through the combine and propagate the field. And then resistance management. It's more than just chemicals. We got to look at some of the weak things that the weed species may have, and particularly Waterhemp. It doesn't have a long soil life, and so maybe in some cases some tillage. But again, if it has a short soil life, then we can do a really good job for 2, 3, 4 years. We're greatly going to reduce maybe some of our problems and stay on top of it. And then there's other things like cover crops and rotation, reduce the row spacings to get crop shading. The weed management is more than chemicals. Obviously, chemicals in my mind are paramount, but we need to have as many things in that weed management program to get as good and as effective weed management. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I guess that really kind of summarizes up the holistic weed management strategies. We need to do as much outside of chemical too. I mean, everybody has always, relied on chemicals as the primary, but with some of the stuff that Nick talked about, multiple modes of action, being resistant to multiple sites, it makes a person, somewhat scared of where we're going to be going in the future. And so we need to look at diversity. And I think the next slide talks about diversity and the fact that, herbicides are a component, but then we also need to look at what we can do outside of that to give us diversity. Again, there's no easy button in weed management. We got to use everything that we can. We got to use any weakness that weed has against it to help, and so a healthy crop is going to shade out some of those weeds, et cetera. We look at the next slide. I think it gives a very good summary, in the fact that, hey, like I mentioned on the very first slide, we've got to start clean to stay clean. That's paramount. We got to look at scouting, make sure that we're making our post-emerge applications at the correct timing, correct size. We got to follow up, make sure that, we got good control and we didn't have some escapes because of a rainstorm or something like that may have. We want to make sure that throughout that season, whether it's pre, early, post, multiple sites of action and really multiple effective sites of action is paramount. Bringing in all this mechanical, cultural, there's been a lot of work here in the last while looking at some additions to combines to look at weed seed destroyers on these combines. So it's a combination of a number of things. We need to be very diligent. If we have a problem field, we need to make sure that we're not bringing that weed seed to other fields. And so how we clean our equipment, our harvest order is all important. And so, again, there's no easy button, and the more diligent we are, the better we are going to be. And so let's go to the last slide. It's in our mind, and that Authority Supreme and Authority Edge are two dynamite products. And we can go to the next slide and start with some questions.
All right, thank you both for that informative presentation. We're now going to begin taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. The first question here says, since MOA have to be changed each year, assuming crops are rotated each year, do you have a 3-year program to recommend?
Yeah, Brent, do you want me to take a stab at this first, and
Sure.
you can
Yeah,
kind of...
we can both do it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, when I think about rotating modes of action, certainly there's products we can utilize in soybeans that we can't in corn, and actually sulfentrazone is one of those compounds. So if we can incorporate an authority product into soybeans, we know we're not gonna use it in corn, so that's gonna establish some diversity. And as we get in the southern part of my territory, we do have a fair amount of wheat, and so by getting a wheat crop into the system, that's gonna break up some of the herbicide rotation as well. And then by planting wheat in the fall, most of the times we've got a pretty dense canopy by the time Waterhemp's ready to emerge. So it can just inherently outcompete as long as the wheat stand is thick enough. So, in terms of a specific 3-year program, it's going to vary by field and overall weed spectrum, but certainly I think crop rotation is going to help us break up some of our selection pressure.
And to add to that, I think there's been studies that even looked at, like I said, multiple effective modes of action. So, if we're in soybeans using a group 14 and a group 15, 2 effective modes of action is very important, and it's probably better than just using one or the other. Obviously, like Nick said, we're not going to use those group 14s to any degree in corn. We're going to bring other modes of action in corn, particularly, let's say a group 27, the HPPDs. And so in corn, we may be, still mixing a group 15 with a group 27, but we're still bringing, multiple effective modes of action each year into that program. And again, the more we can diversify, the more we can bring additional things, bringing in some atrazine in that corn. You're not going to be spraying the atrazine in the soybeans. Those are things that are really going to help in that overall program.
Great, thank you both. I don't have any questions in the chat right now, so I'll just ask both of you maybe to provide some closing thoughts.
Sure.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I can lead off. So, first of all, I really appreciate everybody's time and attention today. In terms of closing thoughts, obviously we just wrapped up harvest, or many of you may still be, going through that process. But one thing to think about when we're out harvesting, or, just reflecting on the season, we always like to make notes, as we get a chance to cross the field at any time. But harvest time is one of the best situations where we can understand any sort of our weed spectrum that might be changing, and really sit down and develop those plans to address any sort of new weed problems, or even situations where maybe the herbicide program that we selected in 2021 didn't work as well. So why is that, and how can we change it? So certainly, as we reflect on the year, and as we get up into developing our management plans, let's think about things holistically. Make sure that we are developing those robust weed management programs, and maybe focus on not allowing those weeds to go to seed. And a lot of times we'll talk about pig hunting is what we refer to it as. But if you're in a soybean production system and you've got one escape out in that field, it's not worth it to leave it. So go out there and hoe it out and take it out of the field, or maybe send your children out there to do that. But certainly our focus needs to be, zero tolerance for seed return.
Hey, thanks, Nick. And I see a question just came up about cover crop. Cress. And again, I'm not going to talk about the individual different cover crops that are out there. I think cover crops provide multiple benefits from soil health, but I think we are also seeing some definite benefits in weed management. It's providing some cover, some suppression of weed seeds germinating early in the spring because of the matter of decomposing or dying cover crops. So I think, cover crops can be very well a part of a weed management. In addition to some of the things that Nick and I talked about, I think with the present situation, my emphasis to everybody is to really start planning ahead early for 2022 weed control programs. There's lots of talk of shortages, a number of products that is going to be difficult to get. I think you need to make sure that you're spending time with your retailer your local FMC representative. Let's make sure that we get our plan started. Let's look at plan A. Let's look at plan B in case, we can't get some of the post treatments or some of the products. But again, I think it goes back to with what I'm hearing, and what products are probably going to be difficult is the pre's have become even more important this year going into 2022 because, I'm hearing of glyphosate issues. I'm hearing of Liberty issues. Those are two key post treatments in our soybean programs. And so to try to replace those is going to be a little more difficult. But if we do a better job with our pre, then we have some more options. And so really, I think plan ahead and get your best foot forward. Let's start clean to stay clean. And again, appreciate everyone's time and look forward to 2022.
Great. And thank you, Brent. We also got a couple more questions in here if we can go through those pretty quickly. The first one says, using multiple overlapping effective sites of action and modes of action herbicide combinations in conjunction with mechanical practices still seems to be the best possible practice. Are there any other that you can think of?
Yeah, so certainly incorporating cover crops into a program can help break our selection pressure up. But I also think about some of the cultural practices and, in the central part of the state, we do have some folks that are still running 30-inch rows, and we know that it's going to take longer to get to canopy in that type of situation. So if we've got more sunlight penetrating, certainly we could see weed flushes later into the season. So if there's an opportunity to narrow up our row spacing, certainly that's going to help us from a cultural perspective. And we've also talked about increasing our seeding rates. And so that's, there's some debate around that, especially as you plant earlier, because if we increase our seeding rates, there's a higher potential for lodging. But if we do have higher densities of soybean plants out there, they're competing against each other. So you typically get longer internodes, which is going to allow them to canopy faster. So just something to think about there.
Okay, one final question before we close out today. If we get into another prevented planting situation, what are your thoughts on a strategy there?
Yeah, so that's kind of a loaded question. So I'll try to do my best here, but certainly if we've got options for managing those populations before they pollinate, that is a good situation. So I think we can incorporate a herbicide treatment into the mix, and maybe something that we don't typically use, in a post-emergence application, normally like a gramoxone. Now, there's some baggage around that, around like drift and things like that, so you have to be careful. But if we can try to desiccate the population with the herbicide prior to pollination, I think that's a good thing. Wouldn't overlook tillage either. In certain areas we're worried about keeping the soil in place, so maybe that's not an effective option. But certainly if we use a more aggressive tillage system, that can do a pretty good job of managing those weeds. And then like mowing as well, as long as we stay ahead of it and we're mowing timely and effectively, those are other things that we can incorporate into the system. And anytime we've got a fallow, so to speak, type scenario, I think incorporating a cover crop into that mix is going to be beneficial, not only for soil management, but also some of the weed suppression benefits that Brent talked about.
Great. Anything to add to that, Brent?
No, Nick did a great job covering it. And again, appreciate everyone's time, and thanks for their business, and looking forward to earning their support in 2022.
Great.
Likewise.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to take a moment to thank Nick and Brent for their presentation this afternoon. And thank you to our corporate partner, FMC, for sponsoring today's webinar. You can find the recording of today's webinar on ISA's YouTube channel. And thank you all for attending. We hope you have a great rest of your day.